Right now, somewhere within arm's reach, there is almost certainly a chip designed by a company you've probably never thought about. It's in your phone. It's in your earbuds, your smartwatch, your car, your television. There are more than 250 billion of them out in the world. More than 30 for every human being alive. They run the device you are most likely watching this on, and they nearly all trace back to a single architecture, designed by a small team in a quiet corner of Cambridge, England. The company is called ARM. It does not make a single chip. It has never owned a factory. It doesn't sell anything you can hold. What it sells is a blueprint, the fundamental design of a processor. And that blueprint now sits at the heart of almost every smartphone on the planet. Apple needs it. Samsung needs it. Qualcomm, Google, Amazon, even your washing machine. They all build on it. Intel, the company that ruled computing for 40 years, tried to kill it and could not. So how did a tiny British team, working with almost no money, end up designing the most widely used processor in human history? It starts, of all places, with a home computer for British schoolchildren. In 1996, NVIDIA had 6 months of cash left and a chip architecture that was already obsolete. Jensen Huang faced a choice that would define everything that came after: scrap 2 years of work and bet the company on an unproven standard, or ship a product he knew would fail. For example, he went to a small Cambridge firm called Acorn Computers, founded by 2 men named Herman Hauser and Chris Curry. The result was the BBC Micro, and it was a hit. It landed in classrooms across Britain, and a generation of children learned to program on it. For a young company, this was a golden moment. But Acorn's engineers could already see the ceiling. The BBC Micro ran on an 8-bit processor, capable for its day, but limited. If Acorn wanted to build a serious next machine, something that could handle graphics and real computing power, it needed a far more capable brain. A 16, ideally a 32-bit processor. If you're enjoying the story so far, take a second to subscribe. We dig into builds like this every week. So Acorn's team did the obvious thing. They went looking at the processors the rest of the industry was already selling, fully expecting to simply buy one and move on. What they found disappointed them at every turn. Nothing on the market was good enough. The 16-bit chips of the early 80s were, to Acorn's engineers, strangely underwhelming. They were complicated, they were slow at the things Acorn cared about. And worst of all, when the team actually measured how these processors handled interrupts, the rapid little tasks a computer juggles constantly, some of them performed worse than the humble 8-bit chip Acorn already had. Hauser, ever resourceful, arranged for his engineers to visit one of the big American chip companies to see how real microprocessors were designed. They expected to walk into a cathedral of engineering, hundreds of specialists, vast resources, secret knowledge. What they found was more ordinary than they imagined. The teams weren't enormous, the process wasn't magic, and the engineers came away with a dangerous, intoxicating thought. If a room full of people in California could design a processor, maybe, just maybe, a couple of people in Cambridge could too. It was an absurd idea. Designing a microprocessor from scratch was something only a handful of giant corporations on Earth had ever done. Acorn had no chip design division. It had no track record in silicon. It had a small team, a tight budget, and a deadline. And yet that is exactly the decision they made. They would not buy a processor. They would build one. Their own microprocessor, from nothing. The job fell to 2 engineers, Sophie Wilson and Steve Furber. Wilson would design the instruction set, the fundamental language the chip would speak. Furber would design the hardware that brought it to life. They were not a 100-person team. They were essentially 2 people with a quiet conviction that the established approach was overcomplicated. They had been reading research coming out of American universities, work at Berkeley and Stanford on something called RISC, a reduced instruction set computer. The radical idea was this. Instead of cramming a processor with hundreds of elaborate instructions, you give it a small set of very simple ones, and you make them run blindingly fast. Wilson and Furber embraced it completely. They kept the design lean, almost austere, partly out of philosophy, and partly because a small team simply could not afford to design anything complicated. In April of 1985, the first batch of their chips came back from the manufacturer. Furber dropped one into a test machine. They powered it up, not daring to expect much. And it worked. First silicon, first try. The processor ran their code flawlessly. For a chip designed by 2 people on a shoestring, this was almost unheard of. They opened a bottle of champagne. But the strangest thing about that first chip was not that it worked. It was something nobody had designed on purpose. something they only noticed when they looked at the numbers. When Furber measured how much power the chip was drawing, the number made no sense. It was tiny, about 1/10 of a watt, a fraction of what comparable processors needed. He assumed he'd made a mistake, so he went looking for the error. And then he found it. The processor was running, the code was executing, but the pin that was supposed to deliver its main power was not actually connected. The chip was working anyway, drawing the trickle of current it needed through the tiny leakage paths in the circuitry that protected its other connections. Let that sink in. They had built a microprocessor so frugal that it could run on the electrical equivalent of crumbs. The leakage current alone was enough to keep it alive. Nobody had set out to design the lowest power processor in the world. The team had kept the design simple to save time and money, and low power consumption had come along for the ride, almost as an afterthought. In 1985, hardly anyone thought that mattered. Computers sat on desks and plugged into walls. Power was cheap and unlimited, but that accidental frugality, the thing they nearly overlooked, would turn out to be the single most valuable property a chip could have. Efficiency would become everything. To understand why the chip sipped so little power, you have to understand the choice behind it. Every processor speaks in instructions, tiny commands like, add these numbers, fetch this value, store this result. Through the 1970s and 80s, the dominant philosophy was to make chips smarter by giving them more and more instructions, including elaborate ones that could do complicated things in a single step. Intel's processors followed this path. The problem is that all those instructions have to live somewhere. Each one demands transistors to decode and execute it. More transistors mean more silicon, more complexity, and crucially, more electricity and more heat. The risk approach that Wilson and Furber chose went the other way. Strip the instruction set down to a small set of simple commands. Each one does less, but each one runs fast, and the chip needs far fewer transistors to support them. Fewer transistors means a smaller chip. A smaller chip means lower cost and, almost magically, far lower power draw. It was a genuine trade-off. The complex chips could sometimes do more per instruction, but the simple ones were lean, cheap, cool, and fast. Acorn had, almost by accident, planted itself on the right side of a bet that would not pay off for another decade. They had a tiny design with a built-in superpower, and almost nobody yet wanted it. Acorn put its new processor into a machine called the Archimedes, a genuinely powerful computer for its time. But the world had moved on. The personal computer market was consolidating fast around the IBM Standard and Intel's chips, and a small British firm with its own incompatible designs struggled to compete. By the end of the 80s, Acorn was in trouble, its independence slipping away. The brilliant little processor risked becoming a footnote, a great chip trapped inside a fading computer company. And then, from across the Atlantic, came an unlikely phone call. Apple was working on a secret project, a handheld device called the Newton. An early attempt at a pocket computer you'd write on with a stylus. A handheld meant batteries. Batteries meant Apple desperately needed a processor that barely used any power, and there were almost none to choose from. Apple's engineers went looking, and they found the one chip in the world that fit. Acorn's RISC machine, the design that could practically run on leakage current. There was just one problem. Apple, then one of the most valuable technology companies in the world, did not want to depend on a struggling competitor in Cambridge for something this critical. They didn't just want to license the chip, they wanted the chip to have a future independent of Acorn's decline. The processor, everyone realized, needed a company of its own. In November of 1990, a new company was born. It was a joint venture. Acorn brought the technology and the engineers. Apple brought the money and the validation. And a chipmaker called VLSI Technology brought the manufacturing muscle. They called it Advanced RISC Machines. Later, just ARM. The headquarters was not a gleaming campus. It was a converted barn in a village outside Cambridge. The entire company was about 12 people. And in that barn, the new firm made a decision that was even more radical than designing the chip in the first place. ARM would not build chips. It would own no factory, stamp out no silicon, ship no product in a box. Instead, it would design processors and then license those designs to anyone who wanted them. Other companies, the Apples and Samsungs and Qualcomms of the future, would take ARM's blueprint, fold it into their own chips, and manufacture them however they liked. And for every single chip they made, they would pay ARM a small royalty. Think about what that meant. ARM's costs barely rose whether the world made 1,000 chips or 1 billion. It had no factories to fill, no inventory to sell. It just collected a sliver of value from every device built on its design. A dozen people in a barn had just chosen a business model that could, in principle, scale to the entire planet. Now they only needed the world to start building. There was just one awkward problem with ARM's grand beginning. The product it had been created for, Apple's Newton, flopped. When it launched in 1993, the Newton was expensive, bulky, and its much-hyped handwriting recognition was unreliable enough to become a punchline. Apple's pocket computer dream fizzled. For a young company whose first reason to exist had just stumbled, this could have been fatal. But here is where the licensing model quietly proved its genius. ARM did not depend on any single device succeeding. The Newton failed, yet the processor inside it had been excellent, low power, and capable exactly as promised. And ARM was free to license that same design to anyone else. So that is what it did. Through the mid-90s, ARM kept its head down and signed up licensee after licensee. Companies building set-top boxes, hard drives, networking gear, all the unglamorous corners of electronics where a cheap, cool-running chip was welcome. It was not a glamorous business. The royalties were small, the company stayed lean, but it survived. And it kept refining its designs, waiting for a market that truly needed what it had been quietly perfecting all along. It would not have to wait much longer. Then the phone happened. In the second half of the 1990s, mobile phones stopped being a luxury for executives and started becoming something ordinary people carried. Companies like Nokia were selling them by the tens of millions, and every one of those phones lived or died by a single brutal constraint: the battery. A phone that ran out of charge by lunchtime was a failure, so phone makers needed a processor that could do real work while drawing almost no power, a chip that would barely sip from the battery. There was exactly one design philosophy in the world built around that need from the ground up: ARMs. The very property that had seemed like a curiosity back in 1985, that strange accidental frugality, was now the most valuable feature a processor could possibly have. ARM's design won its way into mobile phones, and once it was in, it became the obvious choice for the next model and the next. Nokia's enormously popular phones ran on ARM, the momentum compounded. Every chipmaker who wanted to sell into the booming phone market licensed ARM's design, because that was where the software and the expertise already lived. By the early 2000s, ARM had quietly become the standard processor of the mobile phone. It was a good business, but it was about to become something far bigger, because then the smartphone arrived. In 2007, Apple unveiled the iPhone, and the world changed in a way few people grasped at first. A smartphone was not just a phone, it was a full computer that lived in your pocket, ran apps, played video, and browsed the real internet, all on a battery the size of a stick of gum. The constraint that had always defined mobile didn't relax, it intensified. Now a tiny battery had to power something doing the work of a desktop. There was only one kind of processor on Earth that could even attempt it. The iPhone ran on an ARM-based chip, so did the Android phones that followed, so did virtually every smartphone that came after, from every manufacturer, in every country. And here ARM's quiet bet from the barn paid off on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Because ARM didn't manufacture anything, it didn't matter who won the phone wars. Apple, Samsung, Huawei, Xiaomi, whoever sold the most phones, they were all building on ARM. And ARM collected its small royalty on every single one. Billions of chips, pennies each, multiplied across the entire human population. Within a few years, more than 95% of the world's smartphones carried an ARM design at their core. A dozen people in a Cambridgeshire barn had become the invisible foundation of the most important consumer device ever made. And the giant they had just quietly stepped over was the most powerful chip maker in history, Intel. Intel was not blind to what was happening. By the late 2000s, it could see the smartphone boom clearly, and it wanted in. On paper, Intel had every advantage imaginable. The best factories on Earth, tens of thousands of brilliant engineers, and budgets that dwarfed ARM's entire existence many times over. It built a line of lower power chips called Atom, and set out to push its architecture into phones, and it could not do it. The problem was baked into Intel's DNA. Its x86 design carried decades of accumulated complexity. All those rich instructions that made it powerful on a desktop also made it hungry for power and heat. Trying to squeeze that into a phone battery was like trying to fit a muscle car engine into a bicycle. Intel poured billions into the effort. It even paid manufacturers to use its chips. And after years of struggle, It gave up and walked away from the phone market almost entirely. It is one of the great what-ifs of technology. The most powerful chipmaker in the world, with every resource, lost the most important new market of its era to a licensing outfit from Cambridge whose entire advantage was being small and efficient. And ARM was not finished. Having conquered the phone, it now set its sights on the one place Intel still ruled, the laptop. For decades, one rule of computing held firm. Serious laptops and desktops ran on Intel, and phones ran on ARM. The two worlds did not cross. Apple decided to erase that line. Having spent years designing its own ARM-based chips for the iPhone and iPad, getting better at it with every generation, Apple made a stunning announcement in 2020. It would abandon Intel entirely in its Mac computers and replace it with Apple's own silicon, built on ARM. The skeptics were loud. A phone architecture could not possibly power a real computer, they said. Then the first ARM-based MacBooks shipped, and the skeptics went quiet. The new machines were not just competitive. They were faster than the Intel Macs they replaced, and they ran cool and silent, with battery life that stretched across an entire day. The same fundamental efficiency that let a chip run on leakage current in 1985 now let a laptop outperform a power-hungry rival, while sipping a fraction of the energy. Intel had not just been beaten in phones. It was now being pushed out of the very computers it had defined for 40 years. A processor philosophy born out of a small British company's poverty, its inability to afford anything but the leanest possible design, was now running the laptops of the most valuable company on Earth. But who by then actually owned ARM? By the 2010s, ARM's quiet importance had become impossible to ignore, and the giants came calling. In 2016, the Japanese conglomerate SoftBank bought ARM outright for around $32 billion, an enormous sum for a company that still made nothing you could hold. Then, in 2020, an even bigger drama unfolded. NVIDIA, the American chip company riding the artificial intelligence boom, agreed to buy ARM for what would have been around $40 billion, and the world pushed back. Regulators and rival companies across the United States, Britain, Europe, and China objected, and their reasoning revealed just how central ARM had become. Almost the entire industry, fierce competitors who agreed on nothing else, depended on ARM's designs and trusted that ARM sold to everyone equally. Letting one chipmaker own that neutral foundation was, they argued, simply too dangerous. After a long fight, the deal collapsed. Instead, in 2023, ARM returned to the public markets in one of the largest technology listings in years, valued in the tens of billions. The company that started in a barn was now one of the most strategically important businesses on the planet. And the message from regulators was unmistakable. ARM had become too important to belong to any single owner. Step back and look at the scale of what those engineers built. ARM designs sit inside roughly 99% of the world's smartphones. They run tablets, smartwatches, wireless earbuds, televisions, cars, data center servers, and an endless ocean of small devices most people never think about. More than 250 billion ARM-based chips have shipped, a number so large it has lost all human meaning. And the genius of it is how little ARM asks for each one. The royalty on a typical chip is often just a few cents, sometimes a fraction of a cent. On its own, that is nothing. You would not bend down to pick it up off the street. But multiply that almost nothing by hundreds of billions, across nearly every electronic device humanity makes, and you get one of the most quietly powerful companies in the world. This is what makes ARM so strange and so remarkable. It is not the biggest chip company by revenue. It never built a factory. It barely sells anything you can touch. Its empire is made of slivers, a tiny cut of value, taken from almost every computing device on Earth, and every bit of it traces back to a constraint. Here is the part worth sitting with. ARM did not win because it had the most money, the best factories, or the largest team. It won because it had none of those things. A small company in Cambridge could not afford to design a big, complicated, power-hungry processor, so it designed a small, simple, efficient one instead. The limitation was not a handicap, it was the whole secret. For years, that frugality looked like a quaint footnote, a chip that happened to run on almost no power in a world that did not yet care. And then the world changed shape around it. Batteries got small, computers went mobile, and the one property nobody had valued became the only property that mattered. Two engineers, a converted barn, and a constraint they turned into a superpower. That is how the most widely used processor in human history came to be. Not built from abundance. Built from nothing. If a story about the world's greatest builds is what you came for, subscribe. There are plenty more where this came from.